Good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to the RIBA. I'm Jane Duncan, and I am the president of the RIBA. So tonight, we're delighted to partner with the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands to bring together scholars and practitioners for a timely discussion about this unique style of architecture and design. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our very wonderful speakers, some of whom have come all the way from California to be with us this evening. Our chair tonight, Catherine Ince, senior curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, has the pleasure of introducing the speakers individually, so I'll leave that with Catherine, who, prior to joining the V&A, was a curator at the Barbican Centre, specializing in 20th century and contemporary design and architecture. She curated a hugely successful exhibition, The World of Charles and Ray Eames, as well as many others, of course. And she is currently developing the curatorial program, you try saying that, of the V&A East, a new institution planned for the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. But first, I have the great pleasure of handing over to Ambassador David Lane, who would like to say a few words. Many, many thanks for enjoying this evening, and I hope you have a wonderful time.
Hi there. Thank you, Jane. My name is David Lane. I'm the president of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, and we're delighted to partner with Jane and her colleagues to present tonight's program on California mid-century modernism. In fact, this is the first public program the Annenberg Trust at Sunnylands has ever done here in the UK, and it combines several passions of Walter and Leonor Annenberg, who are the benefactors of the organization that my colleagues and I run. First of all, their love for the people and the nation of the United Kingdom. Nearly 50 years ago now, Walter Annenberg began his service as the U.S. ambassador to the court of St. James. It was a transformational period for the Annenbergs, when they forged lifelong friendships with the British royal family, members of parliament, cultural, business, and education leaders across the country. I would also say at this point, given their deep connection and feelings for the UK, I'm sure if they were alive, they would extend their heartfelt condolences to the victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. And I want to extend those on behalf of my trustees and my colleagues. And I did note RIBA's own offer of support for the inquiry, and I commend them for that. The Annenbergs matched their diplomacy with generous philanthropy through major gifts to the British Museum, the National Gallery, the Tate, Covent Garden, and many other institutions. They also had a passion for architecture, as you will soon hear more about Sunnylands, which is their landmark home in California. But here in London, they also undertook a careful and comprehensive restoration of Winfield House in Regent's Park and supported other efforts to restore historic sites throughout the UK. Finally, they were deeply committed to serving future generations, and in that spirit, tonight we have several members of the Young Leaders UK group, and I want to thank them for coming. I had the opportunity to spend time with them in January when I was here visiting the U.S. Ambassador, Matthew Barzin. And finally, we're deeply committed, we also want to acknowledge a new generation of leadership at the Annenberg Foundation Trust, represented tonight by my trustee Elizabeth Sorensen and her husband Johan, who also happen to be neighbors here in London. Elizabeth is the granddaughter of Leonor Annenberg and is ushering the family's legacy into this new era. With the leadership from Elizabeth and our other trustees, all of whom are family members of the Annenbergs, Sunnylands as an institution is working actively to continue the tradition of bringing people together, to bridge divides, and build understanding between individuals and nations. Just to say a word about public policy and what we do with this great building we're going to talk about tonight. President Obama had a number of summits there, and our mission is to promote world peace. We sit in the desert in Palm Springs, but we're focused primarily on fostering international agreement, strengthening democratic institutions, and combating global poverty with an emphasis on fragile states. If you want to know more about those things, go to our website or grab me later. I'm smart enough to know when public policy is the sideshow, we're here tonight to talk about architecture. And so it's my pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator, the esteemed senior curator from the Victorian Albert Museum, Catherine Ince.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Jane and David, for a very lovely introduction this evening. I'm delighted to be here. I guess now I consider myself somewhat of an honorary Californian, having spent so many years going back and forth, visiting various properties across California, but specifically the Eames House, of course, and spending time in their archive. And I feel very close to this period of architecture, and I've had a huge privilege being able to explore some of the houses that we'll see presented this evening and other types of buildings. It's a form of architecture that was, has been endlessly popular and a draw particularly for British architects, and especially those who were contemporaneous with the figures that we're going to be talking about this evening. John Winter, and many others of his generation traveled through California, worked for offices in California, and brought back some of those principles and attitudes towards architecture and lifestyle that were reflected in their later work. So I'm thrilled that we've got a great lineup this evening to tell us more about Sunnylands particularly, and other forms of practice from this period across California. We're going to hear from each of the speakers that I'll introduce now, and then we've got time afterwards to have a discussion, and we'll open up to questions from you guys, if you have any. We're recording the talk this evening, so if you have any questions, I'd ask that you wait until the microphone comes around to you, so we can pick up your question and have it for the recording. So our first speaker is Sidney Williams. Sidney is the former curator of Palm Springs Art Museum. She was based there between 2003 and 2016. She's an art historian by training and was the founding curator of the Architecture and Design Center after its historic rehabilitation of a 1961 bank, which opened in 2014. She's conceived many curatorial projects over the years, and now, most interestingly, I noted that she's working with the Getty in Los Angeles and the Palm Springs Art Museum on a project looking at the relationship between two figures of the modern period, Albert Frei and Lina Bo-Bardi. The show opens in September. There will be a publication, look out for that, with the esteemed Zula Lima from Brazil. So that's particularly exciting, and we're looking forward to hearing from Sidney shortly. She'll be followed by Janice Lyle, who's the current director of Sunnylands, and whose book we're also here to celebrate this evening. It's just been published by Vendome and Thames and Hudson, and it looks at the masterpiece that is Sunnyland. She was first hired by Leonor Annenberg in 2008 to oversee the historic restoration of the property and help its transition from a private residence to a public-facing institution. And she's served for 23 years at the Palm Springs Art Museum and is also an art historian. Our third speaker is Fred Fisher, who's the principal of Frederick Fisher and Partners, an architecture practice based in Southern California. Fred is known for his work in exhibition design particularly, and I think he's going to talk on his own practice this evening. And it'll be particularly interesting to hear about the influences and the formation of a practice still working today. And our last speaker is Pat Kirkham. Pat Kirkham is the Professor Emerita of the Bard Center for Graduate Studies in Design and Decorative Arts History, and is also the Professor of Design History at Kingston University. She completed her PhD at the University of London and is a specialist in a particular period of furniture history related to the furniture trade here in London, but is also known for her work in reassessment of modern and contemporary design through gender studies. She's written many publications focusing on the practice of women designers in the US, on figures like Eva Zeisel, Saul Bass, and not least the behemoth that is Charles and Ray Eames, Designers of the 20th Century, first published in 1995. Here she's going to talk about a different way of looking at the relationship between inside and outside in the Californian situation, and bring us bang up to date with some British-inspired Californian modernism. Anyway, I'm going to leave it to the speakers to explore their subjects, so maybe I'd invite Sidney to the stage first of all. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here at RIBA and to be in London and to enjoy so much of your museum world here. This program was a really wonderful collaboration, and I really thank RIBA and Sunnylands for making this possible. This subject, California mid-century architecture, is a real passion of mine. And though I was born and brought up in Vancouver, British Columbia, I have lived in Palm Springs for more than 4 decades. Having grown up with a brolly attached to my right arm, I was very happy to adapt to the warm climate of the desert, and it was an easy adjustment for me. In fact, the story of mid-century architecture in Palm Springs relates very directly to the climate. Therefore, I have subtitled my talk, California Mid-Century Modernism, Climate, Clients, and Invention. The 3 factors of mild climate, adventuresome clients, and a spirit of invention characterize the development of a particular regional architecture of modernism in Southern California. The possibility of spending time outdoors inspired the architects to blur the connection between the interior and exterior spaces. Wealthy clients from New York, Chicago, and Seattle, as well as celebrities from Hollywood, looked for a desert retreat, a place to get away from the city life and to enjoy the outdoors. And of course, they came to the desert willing to experiment and choose a kind of new lifestyle that was different than their traditional ones back home. They were willing to take risks. The architects saw opportunities for applying modernist principles, using factory-produced materials, expanses of glass, and open plans. Los Angeles aerospace industry, the car culture, and the film and entertainment industry created a sense of design freedom. Seeing the exhibition at your design museum certainly defines California as a place of invention and in creative thinking. These 2 Vienna-born architects, Rudolf Schindler and Richard Neutra, made a huge impact on modern architecture in California. Schindler had studied with Otto Wagner and Adolf Loos before immigrating to America and working with Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin. This is the Lovell Beach House of 1926, one of the first poured-in-place concrete modern houses in America. Neutra also studied with Wagner and, like Schindler, had been impressed by Frank Lloyd Wright's Wasmuth portfolio. They knew each other in Vienna and continued their correspondence as they were both very interested in what was happening in America, and they ended up both settling in Los Angeles. At the aftermath of World War I and the possibilities to explore modern architectural concepts in the United States drew them to establish their practices in Los Angeles. Their work had a profound influence on other architects. The Schindlers and the Neutras occupied the King's Roadhouse that had been designed by Schindler and they lived there together from 1925 to 1930. But the architects and their differing temperaments and their approach to architecture led them to part ways and develop their practices independently. Here is Nitrus von Sternberg's house in Los Angeles of 1935. Schindler and Neutra had, as I said, a profound influence on architecture in Los Angeles and beyond. Three of Los Angeles' most stunning and notable modern houses are shown here. The Charles and Ray Eames house on the lower right of 1949, case study house number 8, which was part of John Intenza's case study house program promoted by the Art and Architecture magazine that he edited. Its cubic design, use of color, and industrial materials made it widely photographed. John Lautner's Chemosphere House, also known as the Malin House, 1961, was designed for an aerospace engineer. Its space-age look evokes the intense contemporary interest in space exploration and speaks to the significance of LA's aerospace industry. Pierre Koenig's Stahl House, 1960, case study house number 22, and this photograph by Julie Schulman really shows how it exemplifies the modern lifestyle in the Hollywood Hills, perched on reinforced concrete beams high above the sparkling lights of Los Angeles. To set the stage for looking at modern architecture in Palm Springs, one of the most famous houses in the world is this Kaufmann House of 1946, a photograph shown here by Julia Schulman. When the Kaufmanns decided to build a desert house, they hired Richard Neutra, who made his international reputation with the Lovell House of 1929, sometimes called the Health House in Los Angeles. The Kaufmanns were impressed with Neutra's work in California, Los Angeles in particular, and commissioned him for this house to the great annoyance of Frank Lloyd Wright, who had designed Falling Water for them. This pavilion in the garden, with its large expanses of glass, features a second-story open room called a gloriette, from which you can enjoy views of the desert. Palm Springs is located in the Coachella Valley on the eastern side and at the base of Mount San Jacinto, a 10,500-foot escarpment, 2-hour drive from Los Angeles. The mountain prevents most of the rain clouds from reaching us, and thus the precipitation average is 5 inches a year. That's kind of atypical for northern climes. Native Americans found the natural oasis of the canyons a cool respite in the hot weather, while the unnatural oasis of golf courses attracted winter visitors. But what attracted the architects to design structures in the desert? The dry desert climate drew health-seeking and sun-worshipping visitors for decades and played an important role in the design of architecture in a harsh, especially in the summer, and dry climate. Architects who design in the desert are acutely aware of sun and shade. Richard Neutra designed 3 houses in the desert. This is the first one he did in 1937 for Grace Miller, who was a socialite from St. Louis. She was a practitioner of the Menzendiek method of functional exercises, and she asked Neutra to design a small house and studio. Neutra had already completed the Lovell Health House, which she was familiar with, so this was a good match of client and architect. In 1937, this house was on the northern edge of the town, surrounded by desert, as shown here in this Schulman photograph. Grace Miller is seen in her enclosed screened porch with a reflecting pool to add an element of water, tempering the heat and sunshine. The desert climate required architects to use materials in innovative ways. Architects responded to the need for shade with aluminum brise-soleil screens or a concrete patterned block, which also added privacy. Steel panels, as in Wexler's steel house seen in the upper right, were prefabricated, easily assembled, and withstood the harsh desert elements. Cast concrete, seen in the Elrod house designed by John Lautner below, is also an ideal sustainable material. When architects design their own homes, they're often on a tight budget and use functional low-cost materials. John Porter Clarke, the first licensed architect to practice in Palm Springs, he began practicing there in the mid-1930s, chose corrugated aluminum panels for the exterior of his two-story home. The living quarters are above and provide shade for the garden patio room below. In 1939, Clarke enticed Albert Frei, who had built the Coker-Sampson building in Palm Springs in 1934, to return from New York to the desert and associate with him in joint private practice. Albert had immigrated from Europe in 1929 after spending 10 months in this atelier of Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret. Echoing the steep verticality of Mount San Jacinto, Albert designed a mid-century gas station. This is known as the tram gas station of 1963 to 65, with a hyperbolic paraboloid roof. 6 steel pipe columns support the 95-foot roof plane. At the entrance to Palm Springs, the building site is at the base of the tramway that goes up to the top of the mountain. After the gas station closed, it was threatened with demolition and became a hard-fought preservation battle. After a period as a sculpture gallery, it is now the Palm Springs Visitor Center and continues to welcome tourists into the city of Palm Springs. The proximity of Palm Springs to Los Angeles brought many celebrities to the desert for some R&R. Time in the sun with golf, pool time, and privacy made Palm Springs an ideal retreat. The Frank Sinatra House, 1947, designed by E. Stewart Williams, a Cornell-educated architect, was influenced by his interest in Scandinavian modernism. This house was designed for easy living with the pool only a few steps from the interior spaces. The Idris House of 1955, also designed by E. Stewart Williams, is set into the boulders of a hillside lot. The expansive roof shades the glass, and the use of warm-hued desert stone and kiln-dried wood unites the interior and exterior. The pool was excavated first, and the boulders used in the landscaping framing the house. The steel houses of 1962 of Wexler and Harrison were originally known as Calcor prefabricated houses, and 35 of them were planned. However, only 7 were finally built due to the rising cost of steel. For these 1,400 square foot houses, Wexler employed a flexible plan with factory-built mechanical core of the house craned onto the site, onto the poured slab, and the exterior walls were constructed in 2 days. On the lower right is a photo of Don Wexler a few years before he died, next to the folded plate model. These houses were neglected, and it wasn't until early 1990s when they were rediscovered and restored. Jim Moore, who's artistic director of GQ magazine in New York, was the initial catalyst. Not only did the architects design homes for celebrities and wealthy industrialists, but they received commissions for schools, churches, hotels, and country clubs. The Spa Hotel Bathhouse, Wexler and Harrison, in association with William Cody, was built in 1958. This was on the site of the ancient hot springs, which gave Palm Springs its name. The spa and hotel became an iconic symbol of the leisure vacation. Originally, the complex was on leased land from the Cahuilla tribe of Indians who are native to our area, and now that the tribe has ownership, they recently demolished the structures to make way for an expanded hotel and casino. William Cody received his architectural degree from University of Southern California in Los Angeles and soon moved to the desert in 1946. Known as Wild Bill because of his raucous lifestyle and unusual and unorthodox office hours, he became the go-to architect for country club houses and numerous fairway houses in these private enclaves. This pavilion for El Dorado Country Club exemplifies the outdoor living attractive for the winter residents. 200 feet above the valley floor, Frei House 2 sits on the hillside above the Palm Springs Art Museum. Albert said that after looking up the mountain for many years, he decided he'd like to live on it. He studied the passage of the sun, winter and summer, for a year and oriented the house north-south, using his favorite tinted concrete block, powder-coated aluminum, steel framing, and glass. He elevated the house above the carport to accommodate a pool on top. The terrain is a challenging one, and Albert used a large rock on the site on which to pivot the house and support the roof. This glass house is nestled into the mountainside, surrounded by native desert plants. Albert chose the yellow of the drapery to connect the interior with the exterior, the blooming creosote and ensealia bushes found around the property. The interior of the house is designed like a ship with built-in furniture serving storage, seating, and work surface functions. The sleeping area on the east side of the house faces the rising sun, and the concrete exterior seating on the east and south exteriors provides places to enjoy the valley and mountain views. Albert spoke about two strands of desert modern architecture, the tent and the cave. His house is certainly a tent, while this John Lautner designed showcase is assertively a cave. Lautner, originally from Michigan, studied with Frank Lloyd Wright at Taliesin West before establishing his practice in Los Angeles. The client, Arthur Elrod, a successful interior designer, wanted an exceptional house for entertaining and according to Lautner, accepted the first concept, and we completed the house without compromise. Ideal client. Really, Fred? The 60-foot span of concrete hovers over vast interior space open to the view of the valley below. This house has one of the most famous pools. Do you recall in Diamonds Are Forever when Thumper and Bambi attacked James Bond and he wrestled with them in the pool? Another house by Lautner was designed for Dolores and Bob Hope. Unfortunately, the planning and execution of this 40,000 square foot house did not go smoothly. Originally proposed as thin shell concrete construction, the Hopes chose steel with cement plaster. When the vast roof was in the framing stage, a fire broke out and the structure had to be rebuilt. Santa Fe Federal Savings and Loan, 1961, E. Stewart Williams. This museum pavilion with its rolling sunscreens to shade the western exposure was an unusual bank design. In 2006, this building was threatened, and after historic designation, has been repurposed as the Palm Springs Art Museum Architecture and Design Center. With the aging of modern buildings, preservation and adaptive reuse have become important issues. While residences are less threatened, commercial buildings that have outlived their original purpose are threatened. The restoration of the Kaufmann House in the early 1990s by Marmol Radziner architects, working with enlightened clients, brought worldwide attention to the legacy of modern architecture in Palm Springs. This sparked a new generation of modernists to revive and restore modern structures. Each house has a story, and the Kaufmann House has many chapters. This slim Aaron's photo taken in 1970 with the one-time homeowner Nelda Linsk and her model friends colorfully depicts the ideal Palm Springs afternoon. Like so many clients, they were drawn to the mild winter climate, indoor-outdoor living, and healthy air, which brings us to the Annenbergs. Thank you.
So I am going to share a story about one of the largest mid-century modern homes in California, the ways in which it is typical and atypical, and a bit about its place in the social history of the 20th century in America. So Sunnylands, which you are seeing here, was the winter home of Walter and Leonor Annenberg. from 1966 until Walter died in 2002 and Leonor died in 2009. Today, the house and the grounds are overseen by the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, a trust that was set up by the Annenbergs for the purpose of using their property to host high-level meetings for the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the Supreme Court justices, and the bipartisan leadership of Congress. And to take advantage of the quality of the interior space for purposes that would foster international agreement. The historic site is also open to the public for the purpose of education about architecture, design, art, and the history of the 20th century. So that the house was designed by architect A. Quincy Jones as a private residence located on 200 acres of undeveloped desert, which was transformed into a park-like setting, as you can see here. It is distinctive in that it is one of the few large estates in the United States to be designed in the mid-century modern style. Sunnylands, its story is also one featuring the collaboration of the owners, the architect, and the interior designer. This is not a home which is entirely an architect's vision. It is very much a home that reflects this team approach made with A. Quincy Jones, William Haynes, and the Annenbergs themselves. The owners, you see here, Walter and Leonor Annenberg. Walter was a successful businessman. He owned a company called Triangle Publications. It published 17 magazine, TV Guide, which was the largest circulation magazine in America for decades. He owned TV stations like the one in Philadelphia that broadcast American Bandstand. And the Annenbergs themselves as a couple were one of the very few couples who both held the rank of ambassador. Walter was the ambassador to the Court of St. James under President Nixon from 1969 to 1974, and Leonor Annenberg was the chief of protocol under President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 82. So they had that aspect of their lives. And finally, they are known as the greatest philanthropists of their own generation, modeling a scale of giving in America for people like Warren Buffett or Bill Gates, both of whom visited Sunnylands. I show you this picture taken in 1963 of interior designer William Haynes because, and you see him standing in front of the land, the undeveloped land, which would become Sunnylands. It's not the most attractive photo of William Haynes, but it certainly gives you a sense of where he was working in 1963. Originally, he was a silent film star in Hollywood. But he became the favored interior designer for Hollywood celebrities from the 1930s on. He had been part of a team with the architect A. Quincy Jones to design the Sidney and Frances Brodie House in 1950. I'm showing you an image from that house here. He also worked with A. Quincy Jones in 1960 on the Harriet and Armand Deutsch's house. The Annenbergs were aware of both of those homes, and they wanted the same team that had accomplished these beautiful structures to work with them. So A. Quincy Jones, the architect for the house and grounds. His practice was in Southern California, where he also taught at the University of Southern California and became dean of the School of Architecture. And that gave him a prominent place in the Southern California architectural circle. He is best known for the more modest houses built by developer Joseph Eichler, like this one, and also for his case study house number 24 for Arts and Architecture magazine, and for his commercial work. I'm showing you another image of the Brody House to make a point about the importance of the indoor-outdoor aspect of A. Quincy's practice, and the importance of the atrium for the lifestyle that he encouraged in the garden houses that he created. Jones submitted the first drawing for Sunnylands in August of 1963, and you're looking at an early collage made in his office for that submission. Notice that there are 3 pyramidal type roofs in this early scheme. And that's because Walter Annenberg said to A. Quincy Jones, "I'd like a house that reflects a Mayan influence." So Jones was influenced by the pyramids at Chichen Itza, which you see there on the lower left, and at Uxmal on the lower right. In the end, there was only one pyramidal roof at Sunnylands, and here you're seeing an aerial view of it, which shows the monitor in the center of that roof. That monitor allows natural light into the center of the interior atrium space. Notice the surprising color, pink. That was Leonor's choice to offset and to remind people of the color pink that she saw on the mountains every day at sunrise and sunset. The first view inside the house features Auguste Rodin's Eve and 300 pink flowering bromeliads that form a little garden around the sculpture. Note A. Quincy Jones's use of modern materials. Here you see the 4 steel columns in the center, the floating wall, egg crate coffered ceiling, and the walls of glass. When Leonor Annenberg first walked into the house while it was being constructed, she looked at those 4 steel columns and she said, "We have a monster on our hands," because she did not like the rawness of the steel. The solution was that they used wooden pegs and they painted those steel columns celadon green. It's a good example of the engagement of the owners in the aesthetics of the house. The garden elements are particularly obvious in this view, where the outdoor landscape combines with the manicured indoor garden to emphasize the importance of nature in California living. A. Quincy Jones also used partition walls throughout the living room and atrium, resulting in a large open space, essentially 6,400 square feet, the size of 5 typical American homes during that period. And that space was arranged in such a way that there was an informal method for moving around it. His floor plan emphasized the geometric aspects of the house, circles, squares, and rectangles, which were meant to be softened by the landscape. So A. Quincy Jones created a modern space using modern materials, which then was filled by William Haynes furniture. So the interior furnishings were all designed by William Haynes, every single piece in the house, in a style called Hollywood Regency. Haynes differed from typical mid-century designers who favored industrial materials. Instead, the sleek and modern lines of many of his pieces were then adorned with fabrics that required great craftsmanship. Here you see the shape of the Regency Recamier style sofa with a modern low floating back, but also with Haynes' signature biscuit tufting. Most designers would be satisfied with that design and those design elements, but Haynes pursued the unexpected detail. So here he heightened the sense of luxury, if you look toward the lower right, by wrapping the metal frame in spiraling cream leather, like the horn of the legendary unicorn, and this is called a unicorn leg. Leonor Annenberg preferred this couch with these colored pillows, again reflecting the influence of the owners and their color choices and the desire to soften the geometric lines in the house. The house was completed in 1966, and at that time there were plants in planters at the base of this lava stone wall. You heard that from 1969 to 74, Walter and Leonor Annenberg were here in London while he was ambassador to the court of St. James. But in 1974, when they returned to America, they made the decision that they would bring their Impressionist and Post-Impressionist paintings with them to Sunnylands. When they did that, those paintings, there were various changes made, the removal of planters, in order to allow those paintings to be shown off against the lava stone walls on the inside. And remember that reference to Mayan theme. William Haynes wrote to Walter a lot during the project, and this particular comment on taste I thought you might enjoy. William Haynes says most people do not have taste, never know they don't have it, thus being extremely happy, like all people who have not been exposed to beauty beyond the point of their noses. He at least gave the Annenbergs credit for inquisitive and Catholic taste. The Annenbergs and their friends, who came to Sunnylands over many decades, contributed to the Sunnylands style. So 7 US presidents visited during the Annenbergs' lifetime. Here you see Ronald and Nancy Reagan dancing with Walter and Leonor Annenberg during a New Year's Eve party in 1985. They came every year during the Reagan presidency. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came for lunch in 1983 while on a goodwill tour of California. The royal family had become friendly with the Annenbergs during Walter's time as ambassador, and so many members of the royal family visited thereafter. Walter was particularly proud of the relationship with the Queen Mum, who sent him her official Christmas card every year, and which he proudly displayed, there you see it towards the center, in what's called the Room of Memories at Sunnylands. Hollywood royalty were also frequent guests. Here you see Bob Hope dancing while his wife Dolores is singing on the right. Other Hollywood celebrities included Jimmy Stewart, Dinah Shore, Grace Kelly, Frank Sinatra, and Frank and Barbara Sinatra were actually married at Sunnylands in 1976. President George H.W. Bush used Sunnylands in 1990 to resolve trade issues with the Prime Minister Toshiki Kaifu of Japan. And here I want you to look at how they're seated. They're on a William Haynes sofa with its trapunto quilting, and there's that Chinese porcelain lamp to one side. Here you see exactly that same location when President Obama met with President Xi Jinping and Madame Peng of China in 2013. In its current role as a high-level retreat center, the aesthetic qualities of Sunnylands are an important part of its magic. And so we maintain the original furnishings, art, and decorative objects in place as much as possible. It also, of course, presents a number of concerns as people sit on our beautiful furniture. This 1968 photo of Leonor Annenberg displays the beauty and intricacy of the fabrics and the use of flowers throughout to continue the story of art, architecture, and nature inside, while recognizing the importance of the constructed nature outside. So you've all seen that broad, undeveloped desert, and then that 200 acres of green in the middle of it. The trust is challenged to balance our preservation ethic, and our Declaration of Trust says that we must keep the estate in excellent repair and condition. The needs of our new mission, which it's no longer a private home, it's a place for important meetings, and a sustainability ethos that calls for an immediate reduction of power and water use when the property transferred to us in 2009. I'm showing you here a 1967 photograph of the landscape that immediately surrounded the house. Note the trees loosely growing between a trellis and the roof, and the bougainvillea falling over those battered walls. This photo was taken in 2009 at the time that the house transferred to the trust, and it shows a very different landscape. The Virginia live oak trees have become very large, and they were topiaried and made into cylinders in order to fit between the trellis and the roof, and the bougainvillea has been removed. So we were dealing with a change in scale for plantings directly around the house and a loss of the original design intent due to maintenance practices. This photo, taken in 2015, shows the reintroduction of the Virginia live oak trees between those trellises and the house in their natural shape, and the reintroduction of the bougainvillea on that bermed wall in order to provide the softness and organic qualities that were part of A. Quincy Jones's original design. Here, our commitment to preservation was connected with the original design intent. Our most current challenging issue has to do with water use and the recent California drought. Originally, there were 180 acres of turf on the Annenberg estate. We eliminated 60 acres from irrigation in order to reduce the required water, and we've changed our reseeding practices. So our current, the way in which we discuss Sunnylands at the moment is that there are 2 months of beautiful golden grass at Sunnylands each year, as we don't reseed and rewater. The need to be responsible stewards of this resource requires a careful balance of preservation, adaptive reuse, and sustainable practices so that this unique estate will be vibrant for years to come, and that the Sunnylands state of mind can continue to influence international leaders and the public. Thank you.
Good evening, and I want to thank the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands and the RIBA for inviting us here. For one who lives most of the time in Los Angeles, any chance to go to London is a great opportunity, even if it's talking for 12 minutes. The comments earlier about working with a client are very appropriate, and I'm speaking first of all as the architect for the renovation of Sunnylands and of the Sunnylands Visitor Center, and also as a current practicing architect dealing with the legacy of A. Quincy Jones. So the photo that was shown of Sunnylands showed the desert landscape, which while the area has developed considerably since then, the site of the visitor center adjacent to Sunnylands looked exactly like that. And I will never forget the day I met with Mrs. Annenberg and walked out onto that sandy site and tried to imagine what one could add to a world-famous estate of that magnitude that would both respect it and not overwhelm it. And Mrs. Annenberg, as you might imagine, had some very specific ideas. And one of the great things about working with her was at 90 years old, while she had very specific ideas which found their way into the project, she was also open to some very different ideas than she was used to in her lifetime, and was open to things that were very different from her way of seeing things before. So this basically shows the notion of this building, which was formulated, and this is one of those after-the-fact conceptual drawings, I have to admit, or watercolors in this case. The building is really conceived of as a garden pavilion, or a series of 4 garden pavilions sitting in a landscape. And the pink areas, you know the importance of pink, are the offices, theater, gallery, administration areas, and work areas. The white areas are the public spaces. The entry is at the bottom, so you can see basically you walk right through the building in both the north-south and the east-west axis. And so the building is really not seen as an object, but it's seen as a frame. And this is really important with Mrs. Annenberg's deep love of nature and of beauty, that the building basically framed the landscape. So you can see here that not only as you approach it, the roof is kept low enough so that you can see over it to the San Jacinto Mountains beyond, but you can see right through the building. This was very much a part of Mrs. Annenberg's way of looking at things, strict formality, and she got that. We had a lot of discussions about that because that's really not my design DNA. She got her formal entrance. I got my asymmetrical glass loggia. And that was an aspect of bringing the art in relationship to nature. That art and nature don't always coexist well because there's light issues, but we wanted to be, for temporary exhibit spaces and for non-light sensitive objects, to have an area where the art could be brought out essentially into the garden in a glass loggia. Once inside, the space immediately flowed out into the garden. So the garden really is, as Philip Johnson said about his glass house, it's the world's most expensive wallpaper. And so the garden forms the decoration of the room. We worked with Michael Smith, who had just completed the decoration of the Obama White House. And he channeled Billy Haynes and I think brought it into the contemporary time. We recalled also the lava stone walls of the estate, bringing those in to give weight and to further frame that view of the garden. Also using mid-century materials such as polished terrazzo on the floor, which was another long dialogue with Mrs. Annenberg, who thought floors should always be marble. So one of the, and that notion of bringing art in relationship to nature. So as you come in and look through the space, the beautiful Giacometti sculpture sitting in front of the view, the garden view, and with the mountains in the background, James Burnett did the landscape. Another transition for Mrs. Annenberg was instead of seeing water as an unlimited resource to make 200 acres of irrigated turf, the new foundation mission of sustainability was put into use, and this is a sustainable, drought-tolerant garden. There's a famous and possibly apocryphal quote of Mr. Annenberg saying the only grain of sand he wanted to see on the property was in the sand traps. But when you're doing a desert garden, there's actually a fair amount of sand and gravel and crushed lava stone So this back, the trellis, which is actually the most specific replication of a Quincy Jones detail at Sunnylands, gives this shaded transition area between the interior space and the exterior garden. You see that tall row of trees is actually the boundary over to the Sunnylands estate. And Burnett brought in the Palo Verde trees to bring in Mrs. Annenberg's beloved yellow into the garden. The conference rooms in the facility as well, immediate connection to the gardens. And shifting gears a bit, I have a long-standing connection to a Quincy Jones in that I met Jones, as most young architects did in Los Angeles, but carried on a very long friendship with his widow, Elaine Jones, which led to acquiring his office building, 1954, in 1995. And so we occupy this building to this day. It's a beautiful mid-century building of Jones's early period, 1954, so it's when he was basically still doing houses. And it has the intimacy of a house. And at the same time, as Sidney was talking about the materials, you see this collage of the concrete block in a square pattern, perforated metal screens, the glass, the stucco. It's a collage facade, I think, that would do any building well done today. But the most conspicuous feature about it is once you get behind the wall, you're in this, what I call a checkerboard of gardens, that every space in the building basically has its own garden. These are small spaces, 15, 20 feet square, and yet you have this feeling of always living in nature. Every space expands out to a garden adjacent to it on one or two sides, reception area. This is Quincy Jones' office and his desk where I sit. And I like to imagine that he met with the Annenbergs in this room while he was designing Sunnylands. You see the floor, seated concrete, radiant heated, is something that Frank Lloyd Wright brought back from Japan. And then the studio, an unexpectedly high loft-like space in the back, an entire wall of glass facing east. Back then, they needed east or north light for drawings. Now we have to fight that light a bit for the computer screens. And then another area where you see this, what can be a very small green space makes a tremendous difference in the feeling of the spaces. Another thing I wanted to add about the influence of the local Southern California context is the notion of light as a media in and of itself. And this is Robert Irwin's installation at the Melinda Wyatt Gallery that was done in the late 70s, and when the Space and Light School was coming into effect. And so those of us who essentially came of age in practicing architecture in Los Angeles and going to the galleries, were very aware that artists were thinking about light as a media in and of itself, not as something that you use to put on art, but as art in and of itself. So bringing this into our current practice, this is the Oburu Gallery at the Huntington Library, and I affectionately refer to this, actually I would mention that the director of collections at the time was John Murdoch, who came from the Courtauld, and so there was a strong Anglophile orientation to the client in this case as well. And this building I would call a love child of the John Soane Dulwich Picture Gallery and Beau and Volert's Louisiana Museum. It has a very formal enfilade series of galleries like Soane's Dulwich Picture Gallery, and it also has the wraparound glass loggia like in the Louisiana Museum. And again, you can probably see where this Sunnylands Visitor Center came from. Mrs. Annenberg actually knew and liked this building, and it was one of the things that helped us gain that project. So you see the art coming out into the loggia in relationship to nature, consistent with the mission of the Huntington of art, essentially art in the garden. And then inside, it has this very formal set of enfilade galleries based on Soane's Dulwich Picture Gallery that housed at the time while the mansion was being renovated, these great Gainsborough, Mrs. Siddons, and Lawrence's Pinky in the background, and which is another connection between England and the Los Angeles collectors. So another project, recent project, again, this is an Annenberg Foundation project, the Institute for Science and Technology at Caltech, and this is some of the smartest people on earth that are working on collaborative ventures based in computer science. And this is taking that notion of bringing the inside out and vice versa, moving the staircases in themselves outside the building. And so we wanted to bring the life of the building and the life of the campus together on these staircases. It's a place where you can step outside, make a cell phone call. And Mrs. Annenberg was still around and involved, and she helped us choose the colors for this building that we were using to blend into the campus landscape. That notion of the atrium that you saw at Quincy Jones at Sunnylands and was also used in this building. It's a fairly deep building for a research building. The team working offices and private offices, actually, they both orient outward and inward into what we call the town square, where you bring in daylight into the center and have this space of social connection. And then at the prime point in the building with the best view of the outside, the mountains and the gardens is what we call the tree house, where the inside is brought in and a social space for the residents of the building. So thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Okay, I was told to wait and not touch anything till something changed. Okay. Well, by an almost miraculous coincidence, the first image that I selected turned out to be a building, a 1955 building by Sidney Williams' father-in-law, E. Stuart Williams. I didn't know that was going to happen. But it was images like this that made me start thinking about things that problematize this notion of a seamless integration of inside and out. And perhaps it's my perverse nature, or the pernickety historian in me. At the time I was working on the big California Modern show for the LA County Museum, and my very close friend was the curator, and she kept saying, "You're spoiling things, you're finding things that we don't have room for in the exhibition." But I was very intrigued by the intense similarities, but also the number of differences I was seeing in hundreds and hundreds of moments where the inside moves to the outside, and it's really just some of those I'm going to talk about. First of all, you see the foliage coming in, you see the wall, and that does continue, but it goes into a fireplace. And suddenly, even here, the furniture is very different. And there was a lot of really interesting stuff written at the time about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate for each side of this supposedly seamless divide. And actually, I think we've seen a lot of thick white shag carpet in many, many of the images tonight, and I normally have to sort of impress that upon an audience, but you've seen a lot tonight. I don't know if you're aware of them as I was, because that's one of the things I'm going to be talking about. I have to catch up sometime, so I'm going to press on, and I'm going to look at a house now by Albert Frei, and it's the Raymond Loewy house. Oh, no, it isn't. Oops. Did I want to be there? Oh, well, let's stay here anyway, because there's some really interesting things said about the Chemisphere house, 60 to 61, and I really liked my colleagues talking about the cave and the tent. And this is, in many ways, a very cave-like house, that you have at one level a seamless integration, but you certainly can't go outside because you would kill yourself for about 90% of this. And again, the seating is facing inward. The seating isn't that you're looking out at this, what's the most cineramic. This is a Hollywood building if ever. And I live in a modernist house, and it's really interesting how you move the furniture from looking inwards to also looking out towards this amazing view. So this house, I think, is a really interesting one to think of. And you see the thick shag carpet as well. That's a problem when you're having traffic inside to outside, because who cleaned these things is what I want to know. Then I also pick another really famous one in terms of seamless integration of inside and out. And this is a style house. One of my dear friends used to live in the house just below, and I would often look up at it. First of all, the kitchen is really a room. It's a Japanese pavilion. It's a room within a room, a real sense of enclosure with I like the idea of the wallpaper around. But again, the furniture facing inwards, not facing outwards. And here we get to the Albert Frei house, 46 to 47 in Palm Springs. We're actually in Palm Springs for a moment. Raymond Loewy always liked to say that he collaborated on this house, and I think that's certainly true. And if we look at the top left, you see the swimming pool coming into the house, and there's a boulder. I think this is pretty much a conceit, because it comes in for about 6 feet. There's a strategically placed huge bowl of fruit on some thick white shag carpet, because I don't think they want the seamless movement between inside and out, because it's filthy outside, it's desert, there's sand and dirt around. The other thing that's interesting, and usually it's only when you get an article with a lot of images or you get contact sheets that you see these houses constantly with curtains drawn over them. And I don't know about you, my house is in Leicester, but for the last 2 weeks, I've barely opened the curtains because it's too damned hot. And this is a period without air conditioning. And so I think those beautiful orange curtains we saw were closed many more times than we think of in photographs. And I had to dig deep. I suspect half the photographs Julia Schulman took, when you add them up, you can see curtains closed. There was nobody at home. He was forced to take them. The ones that get shown in our architectural history books are the ones with the expanses of glass. So we have the barrier of the curtains, and the top right, when they had a party, they had to have a real physical metal barrier to stop people falling into the pool, although there are many Hollywood stars who recollect falling into there after a few drinks. The other thing I want you to notice about the top right-hand image is, of course, it gets cool at night in the desert. Some of you can tell me more about that. But also of the formality of the clothing. And one of the things we discovered during the California Modern Show was just how much formality indoors there was. A lot of discussion about informal living, but also a lot of discussion also about wanting beautiful, luxurious woods, luxurious carpets, and nobody had a more luxurious interior than Raymond Loewy. I'm not going to talk about that now. And then the bar, California mid-century modern. This is chintz and something else. This is what they were imagining people wanted to do their drinking in. But I'm moving on again, just to show you some carpet, but luckily we saw a lot of it. This is the Bailey House, a case study house, very near the Eames house, and they became close friends. Again, very nice, expensive, pure wool carpet right up to the barrier, but we have heavy furniture inside, this beautiful alto, heavily upholstered chair with the so-called butterfly chairs. You could get them for $5 each by 1955 in California. So my question here was, does this little boy have seamless access through here? I think he went with his bicycle round a different entrance. Then this is the Entenza house, the case study house next door, and actually on the same plot as the Eames house. And again, at random from Julius Schulman, but with curtains closed, and very careful choice of curtains. It's an interesting house because Entenza, we're thinking of tents, and Entenza spoke about it at night as being like around a campfire. Well, this is glam camping at its most extreme, with beautiful plush carpeting, but at night he liked to have sometimes the curtains drawn back because it wasn't so hot, to have that darkness and pretend he was in a tent. And the link I'm going to make in terms of the sense of enclosure, there was a lot of discussion, and Tenz actually had a study that he called the womb room. It had no windows whatsoever because he felt he couldn't concentrate with windows. And the young girl who lived there, when he sold it, her parents loved the house. I had a long correspondence with the teenage girl who moved in. She hated it because she hated that notion that architectural students would come and peer in your window and things. But I do think the Saarinen womb chair is connecting with something about the need for a sense of enclosure at the very time that these wonderful buildings that I love and live in are opening things out. The Eames house, you see, doesn't have these big, broad expanses of glass. It has a lot of very small pane windows. A lot of the glass is opaque. Some of it's etched. It's saying, I'm glass, be careful, you'll crack your head if you walk here. And it's tucked away behind some eucalyptus trees. So I think their house is quite different in many ways. And Charles always liked to talk about it as an old cave that they stuffed full of their favorite belongings and memories. And you'll just notice at a quick glance, usually their lounge chair and ottoman is just covered in rugs. And they really, I think, didn't sit on any of their mass-produced pieces of furniture. And you can see in the far left of the right-hand side, the built-in alcove. That's where they had their friends. That's where they had their discussions. It's really a little cave within a cave. And I just show you a picture from it in the 70s and a 1960 image of Billy Wilder and Audrey Wilder, who very kindly one weekend asked me to go to Palm Springs with them. I had arrived in LA and Billy had told me to phone him. And I did, and he said, oh, it'd be great. We're just setting off, why don't you come? And I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't have any money. I've just spent it all getting to Los Angeles. And then I said, oh, I'm ever so sorry. I have to give a paper at an academic conference. So I never got to Palm Springs. And this is one of the great regrets that I didn't get to meet. I mean, they were with all the Rat Pack. So in my imagination, I met Frank Sinatra and everyone. Thinking about indoors and outdoors, the metal stands to these beautiful planters by Architectural Pottery, an LA company. They rusted a bit outdoors, and there's a really lovely company memo from the mid-50s saying, you know, people want something different indoors. And they made these beautiful wooden stands for the equivalents indoors because they wanted something more formal, something that looked like it wasn't to be used outdoors. And then I know the LA climate, and I know that even there for several months of the year, it can rain, it can drizzle. Ray Eames always regretted not putting a fireplace in their house. And this barbecue that also doubles as a fire pit was really quite popular, and it made me think about indoor-outdoor living and just when you can do that. And in Northern California, it's quite a different issue, I think, from Southern California, and even, as this Hawks brazier manufacturer said, even in Southern California, you need this as the fire pit sometimes to keep you warm. The television is the other great thing that I think drew people inside in the 1950s and 60s, indeed challenged the Hollywood industry. Have I got 1 minute? Catherine's And this is my house in Leicester, the bottom, I think, showing a lot of Eames' influence, and by a total coincidence, I wasn't looking for it. I was fiddling around in the Eames' Christmas card collection, and there was a thank you Christmas card from fellow Atkinson, one of the architects of my house, the lead architect, AA-trained London firm, and it also has a rather unknown woman architect, Brenda Walker, and you see some of the small panes, and you can, my grandson and I, we stick our Leicester City football stickers on a lot of this glass because he and I have cracked our heads more times than we care to remember. And there's an internal glass door that I actually crack my head on more than anything, and it's not funny, really. I didn't think about that before I lived in one. And looking at the soft yellow, almost white brick of the outside, makes me think of the whole complexity of really trying to talk about the spread of California modernism, because I think, as all the wonderful talks before me showed, there's a lot of other influences there, particularly European modernism and particularly Scandinavian modernism. And so I think when we're writing about mid-century, we've got all of those things. And certainly when we looked at individual houses, they might have been made in California. The contents in them were often Swedish, Danish, Japanese, Italian, as well as American. And I'm going to stop there so we can have more time for discussion. Thank you.
It's on. Okay. Thank you. That was fabulous. What a romp through an amazing set of buildings and the Annenbergs. I want to know more about them. What fantastic discussions you must have had about the setting for their art collection, and I'm intrigued by them as clients, and I wondered if we could maybe start there, unpick that a little bit, because it seems to me, in my slender knowledge of such things, that perhaps sometimes the female in a married partnership like that perhaps receded in terms of making some of those judgments. I went to the Stahl house and discovered Mrs. Stahl's only expression to be in the very small water closet. But Leonora strikes me as somebody quite different.
Yes, I would say that Leonor had very strong opinions, and she felt very much a part of a team. So she and Walter collected art. They had this amazing collection of Impressionist, Post-Impressionist paintings, which they purchased jointly. And so they always had to agree on which paintings they would add to that collection. But when it came to the house, I believe she had a very, they both had a good relationship with William Haynes. They both engaged via writing, etc. But she very clearly connected with William Haynes, and many of his recommendations about the objects that they might acquire to further furnish their house. So the introduction of Chinese porcelain, Chinese cloisonne, that had not really been a part of their collection before, and it very much reflected that William Haynes, Leonor, Annenberg connection.
Well, as it was pointed out, Mrs. Annenberg was an ambassador, chief of protocol, and when one meets with the chief of protocol of a president as a client, one shows up an hour early, and one wears a suit and tie, even if it's 110 degrees in the desert, and you're walking around in the sand. And but Mrs. Annenberg was a very engaged, very perceptive client. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She understood drawings, models. She was interested in every detail. There were extended discussions about door handles, very extended discussions about paint colors, and lots of discussions about material choices. The terrazzo floor was one of the longest, most complicated discussions because The Sunnylands is all beautiful marble floors, and we felt that the visitor center, in a way, I refer to it as a sorbet course. It's something that prepares you for Sunnylands. It's not the Sunnylands experience. And so I always felt that things had to be dialed back a level. So the Palm Springs, the practicality and economy of the terrazzo seemed appropriate. Mrs. Annenberg really had a hard time with that, but eventually that's what we got, and I think it was the right decision. As I said, in terms of the formality, there were things, my work is not formal at all. Asymmetry, classic modernism, shifting volumes, influence of Quincy Jones, Japanese architecture. But Mrs. Annenberg wanted central axes, large, tall, symmetrical doors, as in Sunnylands, and that's what we got.
And the sort of tension between this sort of the wild nature of Palm Springs and the artifice of the gardens and the grounds and the acres that were created there is particularly interesting, and perhaps an expression of that desire to create a sort of classical control. I wonder maybe if we could pick up on the cave, tent, womb-like expressions that we experience in some of these
Well, the glass house, like the Frei house, certainly has that transparency where the surrounding landscape is very much a part of it, the view is part of it, and Albert wanted the freedom of living in a very simple, very finely detailed interior. I love taking architects up to the house because the house is very hard to photograph. The original house was only 800 square feet. There was an addition later, a few years later, added a 400 square feet. So some people in Palm Springs have said, well, it's smaller than some people's closets. You know, it's a very tiny house with built-ins that are very, very functional. But the architects get it immediately. They are so responsive to the space and the careful arrangement of form and combining all those functions of sitting, of workspace, of dining, and sleeping all within 800 square feet. It's pretty remarkable how he managed to do that. So, yes, I think his vision has been very influential, I would say, to architects of other generations.
Actually, I mean, I think I was just very surprised at the constant discussions of people I didn't expect to, talking about the houses as cave-like or whatever, and finding all this formality. But one of the things that really struck me was actually going to a Quincy Jones house, which was the one that he lived with Elaine. I only knew that place after Ray Eames had died and Quincy Jones had died. And I'd always thought I would love to live in the Eames house, but I came out of there thinking, oh, I'd rather live there. And I think it was the atrium. And I do think the way that Jones used these spaces with what seemed like nature, and it's all highly, manipulated nature, but nonetheless seemed more like nature than these potted plants or planters. The Eames had a big planter with wheels on so they could move it around, but didn't. I think that was more effective in terms of really making an intimate relationship between indoors and out within the indoor space. And I'm not sure many other architects achieved something like that. I think often the relationship has this strange transitional space to what's then a very natural landscape outside that is like the wallpaper, but in between, there's sort of patios and you have Garrett Ekbo and people developing a whole type of landscaping that's not nature with a capital N, that I think, I think Frei and people were trying to get at in these small houses in Palm Springs. So I'm glad you talked about the atrium because it really made a huge impression on me, and I would still like to live in a house with one.
I think one of the things that's been pointed out about Quincy Jones is that he was a master of choreography. And I think that in his buildings, I think the Brody House is an excellent example. It was actually the first collaboration between Jones and Billy Haynes. It's a very dynamic house to be in, and the indoor-outdoor relationships are important, but the sense of movement in that house, I think, is exceptionally strong. And it's just a different way of moving. The Sunnylands, I think possibly by the influence of the Annenbergs, is very formal, and it doesn't have the same kind of serendipity to the movement. It's a wonderful ceremonial house and an entertaining house. The other works by Quincy Jones, such as Our Office, you find yourself moving in this deflected axis manner, as I mentioned, which it is very much in the spirit of Japanese pavilions, where you're moving along an axis, you confront a wall, you shift, you move again, there's a garden on one side, and a term that Quincy Jones used explicitly was the notion of serendipitous encounter. And he wanted to set up the circulation so that people would meet each other in unexpected ways for a conversation. And that, we find, has been very applicable in academia, because work groups in academia will constantly say that some of the most important insights that happen between faculty members, between students and faculty members, is in those accidental conversations that take place in a hallway. And so one of the legacies that we've had by living in a Quincy Jones building for 20 years now is that what we've picked up on in terms of choreography of circulation to make sure that people are bumping into each other and that they're in intimate times and in larger groups, and that spaces, that the in-between spaces and the circulation spaces are as important as the primary spaces.
I'm extremely conscious of time, and so I think maybe we should invite you to ask a question if anybody has one. Be brave, this gentleman here.
Hello, thank you. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about the case study houses, as they are such an influential part of mid-century modernism. As I understand it, they came out of necessity, innovation out of necessity in terms of materials that were available left over from the war effort, like steel, I guess, and glass, I don't know. But I just wondered why more weren't built and what lessons we might take from the whole experiment today.
Well, carry on.
Well, I would say among those of us who have practiced in Southern California for a long time, it's a point of great discussion and, in a way, sadness, in that that marvelous flowering of modernist architecture after World War II, when you had a tremendous demand for the housing for the returning veterans and a need for economical housing. One of the points about this modernist era, while we have seen some spectacular grand houses, is that the essence of the case study and these houses were economical, practical living spaces for families. These were 1,400 square foot houses. And what happened was that that other dimension of California living, which is the story. It's everyone can go there and have their own fantasy of an English cottage, of a Mediterranean hacienda, and that notion of creating your fantasy is really overwhelmed that abstract notion of a international style, pure modernist living. And those of us who love those communities, and they're sprinkled throughout Southern California, it is something that we think about with nostalgia, is what could have been, and was really overtaken by popular taste, and the developers that were building these homes by the thousands saw that that's where the market was.
You know, I mean, I think with the case study program, there was always a gap between the notion of the prototype and the actual houses being for specific clients, and this rather wishy-washy hope that it might become a prototype. And the Eameses were certainly involved with one mass housing project, and that really didn't come to fruition because the developers just thought it was, at a moderate income level, just, wouldn't sell in terms of the aesthetic. Saul Bass, again, the graphic designer, was involved with similar things. And actually some Hollywood producers and people trying to fund these more radical things, but they're few and far between.
But I think that's one of the reasons why Palm Springs is such a mecca for mid-century modernism, because there were developers who actually created large numbers of affordable homes in our region, and they remain today. And so there was a success, and we think, based on the importance of the environment and the sort of attitude of the people who went to the desert, who wanted to do something different than what they did in their more traditional places.
What Janice is referring to are the Alexander homes that were designed by Palmer and Kreisel. Bill Kreisel just passed away last week, very sadly, but there are, I think, over 3,000 homes in Palm Springs that are a result of the collaboration that architectural firm and developers, and they have become treasures in the desert now. Although at the time they were built, they were very modest in expense, and they were a one floor plan that could be turned with different roof styles so that it didn't look like cookie cutter houses. There was a lot of variation on the street and different kinds of landscaping. But what happens now is that these houses sell for over $1 million, and they're 1,400 square feet. So times have changed, but they are being restored and loved, which is also important.
We've got time for one more question. The gentleman at the front here. Could you wait just 1 sec for the microphone? Thank you.
I want to refer for a moment to a different environment, which is in the East Coast in Long Island, where you also had at that generation houses that were built very similarly, and they were built in the middle of potato fields with large expanses of views. And the fun thing about all of these glass windows is that you had this lovely perspective to look at. But what's happened since then is that there have been more and more of these houses and less distance between them. And in fact, now it's a suburb. And so since there's no privacy, people build all these privet fences all around. So the whole, I don't know how to put it, it's a completely out of place metaphor or sort of stylistic type. You sort of wish they had all built them more like the Spanish style, which brings the indoor and the outdoor inside of a courtyard. And I'm just wondering whether the same problem has come about in Palm Springs, that over time these things, unless you happen to be Mr. Annenberg, who have all that acreage, that you find yourself, with your neighbor right next door and you want to have some privacy.
Well, people use landscaping like ficus hedges for privacy now, so they create these exterior rooms around their houses. So there's so much living outside on the patios and in the land that privacy isn't so much of a problem, I don't think. The fences are not, they're not built.
And because that mountain is such a major presence everywhere in the Palm Springs region, they can't actually ruin that view, So even though you may be close to somebody who's a next door neighbor, you still see above and beyond, and you look at that mountain and you get that sense of nature.
I think you see that a lot in the case study houses in Los Angeles. The Stahl House has some exterior walling to sort of enclose your arrival area. And between the Eames House and Tenza House, case study houses number 8 and 9, the planting has matured and been left so that it creates a sort of natural barrier between what was very open land. But the Intenza House had a new house built in front of it, so now the Intenza House is the sort of granny flat to the big 1990s concrete box, and that's very fenced in, very walled in, and you do get this situation of yes, people like me trying to peep through. Yeah, I think it's a natural consequence of that jostling together on the Hollywood Hills.
Yeah, and a consequence of a lot of people, particularly, I think, on Long Island, where I lived, and also in California, not wanting to live in 1,400 square feet. They want 14 bedrooms and build to the property edge, you know.
That's all we've got time for. Thank you all so much. It's been a fabulous evening. And